Good, welcome. Thanks, Fatma, again for putting these together every year. They're just fabulous. Yeah. And thanks to the community for coming out. I don't usually use this kind of thing, so I'll just say ahead of time, bear with me if my thumbs get too big. So I have been studying a set of Civil War letters, 70 Civil War letters, from a man that we would call a common soldier. Let's try this. Named William Rufus Barlow. He's always been known as Rufus to his family, and so I'm going to call him Rufus as we go. Rufus was a yeoman farmer, a non-slaveholder, a non-elite gentleman farmer of Caldwell County in the Blue Ridge foothills of North Carolina. So I made my little star there. Between August 22nd, 1862, and January 1st, 1865, which is roughly 2.5 years, Rufus wrote more than 70 letters home, mostly to his wife, Elizabeth German Barlow. We have almost all of his original letters. We have none of her letters back to him. I'm a feminist literary scholar. One of the goals of feminist literary criticism is to address a historical absence or silence of women's voices in literature, and to the extent that we're able to recover these voices, learning in the process about culture, about history, that led to the silence or erasure of these voices, and thereby get a better understanding of how gender works today, why we are where we are today. So this is the broad critical ground from which my research derives. And there are other more specific critical projects that I'm addressing in this, which is going to become an article, but I'm only taking a very small slice of it out for you today, sort of a public face of what I'm working on. So this ghost is what I'm interested in. So who is Elizabeth German Barlow? She's not totally invisible to us today. We have actually two pictures of her. So here's one of our pictures of Elizabeth and Sidney, her son, with Rufus. We find her presence on some supporting government documents. She's on census documents. She's in the will of her husband. She's in what we would call instruments of government. But these aren't her story. These aren't her voice, of course. And before I continue speaking of the voice of Elizabeth, I do want to recognize that those obscured and erased and otherwise silenced voices of women during this time period, particularly black women, both enslaved black women and free black women, as well as the voices of Native American women, both groups of whom were living in Elizabeth's community. But because of her relative privilege of being a white woman, it's more directly accessible to us. So this task of going back to address this erasure and ultimately a denial of humanity of some groups of women is a more important job. That needs to be done. But back to what I'm doing today. So there are 70 plus letters. Fortunately for us, Elizabeth was really into preserving these letters. Without her, we wouldn't have them. Let's look at a timeline to find out why it was so important to Elizabeth to preserve these 70 letters. In 1861, when the Civil War began, Elizabeth German, who was 21, weds William Rufus Barlow, who was 33. Within a year, they have their one and only child, Sidney Stokes Barlow. By August of 1862, William Rufus Barlow enlists in the Confederate Army. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Not 4 years after their marriage, he is dead. He dies in January in Elmira, New York. So why does she keep all of those letters? So number one, clearly she wants to preserve a relationship that she started and was never able to carry out. So she can preserve it through the letters, having the letters. But number two, a more compelling reason is that their son never got to know his father. So through the letters, through his words to his son, his praise of his son, advice, solace, prayers, she can give this to her son. And indeed, that's what she did, so that he can know his father. And one of the key arguments of another critical outlook, I guess you could say, that I use in my written research is called epistolary theory. And you know what an epistle is. It's a letter. So in epistolary theory, one of the keys is that the letter can be a stand-in for the human, right? So by keeping the letter, they're keeping sort of an embodiment of this member of their family. And that becomes the third reason it's very important for Elizabeth to keep the letters, because William Rufus Barlow was not buried. His body did not come home to North Carolina. He was interred in New York after dying at Elmira prison camp in Elmira, New York, from pneumonia. He died of pneumonia just shy of 3 months before the Civil War was over. So he's buried there, and they couldn't afford, of course, to bring his body home. So the letters are a stand-in for the body. Fortunately, even though the letters from Elizabeth to Rufus are lost, she did, by keeping his letters, she did manage to preserve a ghost of her own letters. And that's what I went to look for when I finally got the letters in my hands. From my analysis, I found that she must have written 19 letters. I identify 19 distinct letters he refers to. And just for a second, I wanted to ask if we favor. Do you think we favor? Because this is my great-great-grandmother, and this is my great-great-grandfather, and this is my great-grandfather, Sidney, here. So I don't think we look very much alike, but there are other members of my family that do. Yeah, maybe not. So something that you need to know about Rufus is that he's what was called a late enlister. And you may have noticed, you know, he doesn't automatically join up in 1861 when the South secedes. And that's because he didn't want to. He didn't want to fight. As you may know, in western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, there was a huge number of people who were anti-secessionist, anti-Confederate. They weren't necessarily pro-Union. They just didn't think there was any need for a war, and there was not very much institution of slavery in the mountains. So he eventually had to join, though. He wanted to avoid the stick of the draft, and he wanted to take advantage of the carrot of the bounty, so they would pay you to sign up in advance of the draft. And he took advantage of the bounty to help pay for a property he had just purchased. And he never writes in any of his letters in support of the Confederate cause. All he wants to do is stay alive and come home. So despite their lack of allegiance to the side, she apparently, from what I can glean from his letters, never tells him, you know, go fight, be valorous, be brave. Her letters always say, come home, come home, come home. Do whatever you can to come home, because the ghost of those letters is him saying, I hear you telling me to come home, but I can't. I can't. All right. Elizabeth endeavored and succeeded in running the farm, running their home while he was fighting. What can we learn about her in this process? As I noted, she is very keen on him coming home because of all that she had to manage. There are 5 main things that she was doing, we can tell from the letters, while he was gone. She was coordinating the labor pool. They had over a 100-acre farm. So this labor pool was from a dwindling number of males in her community. They were old men, they were injured men, they were teenagers and boys. So she had to coordinate that. She participated in the manual labor herself, not just labor that she would have been doing already, but field labor at this point, slaughtering of stock, cutting and hauling wood, helping out with these kinds of things in the woodlands of their farm. She was thirdly doing home manufacture, sewing clothes, producing butter, bringing in the honey, jarring the honey, making molasses, preparing and baking food, some for sale, some for home consumption, and some to send to her husband to sell to fellow soldiers. And she was also managing the storage of their grain, which came off of their farm, managing their livestock, and caring for not only Sydney, but 3 to 5 other children and teenagers who would come into her home and live with her to help. Well, she had to raise them. Plus, her mother-in-law, her sick mother-in-law, lived with them as well. Finally, she had to interact with the community members, the merchants, the doctors, the livestock traders, people she needed to breed the mare with, etc., relatives who had business dealings with her husband. So 3.5 months into his service, so he joins up in August, and by December, 3.5 months in, he notes he has received 3 or 4 lovely letters from her, and he references her hand. I've gotten a letter from your sweet hand. And this we find in letters when we study epistolary theory. We find that often that mention of the very corporeal act of writing a letter, that it comes from my beloved's hand, establishes or recommits them to a relationship, long distance. So he says, and I'll read it as he writes it because, he is educated, he has a common school education, but he doesn't have a college education. You don't know how much pleasure it is for me to get a letter from your sweet hand. I hope you've got shed of the mules. I'm afraid you'll have to buy corn, and it is so high that a mule will soon eat off its head. So by that, corn is very expensive now that the war is on, and for a livestock to eat off its head, that's a saying for eat more expensive grain than the animal is actually worth. So she's got to get rid of the mule. He goes on to address some further points of her last letter. I'm sorry that you did not sow your wheat sooner and that Horton Barlow could not do more at it than he has. You wrote that you wanted me to come home and eat and drink with you and stay with you. You don't know how glad I would be to come home and stay with you, but I fear that I will not get to come till the war is over, if I should live. So I want you to send me some apple and onions and butter and honey and brandy if you have it, and some red pepper and soap. So then we imagine Elizabeth, I don't have enough on my plate. Let me go pack all of these things up and have them, have one of our cousins walk it up to Virginia for you. 10 days later, he writes again from Virginia. They're in Campton, Virginia, and we're still in December 1862, and he references a letter he received the night before from her. I received your kind letter last night and was so glad to hear that you was all well. It filled my eyes with tears of joy. You don't know how glad I am to get a letter from you. I was sorry that nobody had sold my mules, and that Sidney, her brother Sidney, not their son, had quit staying with you. I know you have a hard time, and I'm sorry for you, but I can't help it. If I could, I would. Don't get fretted or angry, but pray to God for help, and pray for me, who loves your sweet soul and body so good. You are such a good wife, and so smart, and so purty. So that is the tenor of most of these letters. He goes on in this same letter and changes the addressee to her parents. So one of the things about Civil War letters, papers out premium, so they write multiple people on the same letter, and you just have to share it around. And so that raises all kinds of questions of how revealing can he be, you know, how honest can he be. But at the end of this letter, she's supposed to hand it on to her parents, and in effect, her dad is supposed to be reading it. I received a letter from Elizabeth, his wife, last night that stated that John Davis and Smith German was dead. They're always going back and forth. This person's dead, this person's sick, this person's had his leg blowed off. And then he goes on in that part about why Elizabeth still hasn't sold the mules. And he says at the end, I'm afraid Elizabeth has too much to do. He's concerned enough with the reports of hardship to mention it to her father. And life in Caldwell County is progressively worse and worse and worsening. There are male labor shortages, there are crop failures. But not only that, the government, the Confederate government, is now seizing and reapportioning grains and stock out of families and sort of rationing it around. So people are beginning to hide their own stores. Bands of deserters and stragglers are going around also marauding and stealing out of barns. And she writes him regularly of these bits of bad news and asks him to come home without leave. It's very clear. He addresses some of this news in a letter March of 1863. Actually, that's 1864. I received a letter from you yesterday. I was so glad to hear from you, but I don't know when I'll get to come home and live with you and be a great satisfaction to you, Elizabeth. I know that you're in a heap of trouble and has a hard time. I'm so sorry for you. It almost breaks my heart, but I can't help it. I'm here, and if I run away to get home, I may be killed and disgrace my little children. But as soon as I can get a furlough, I will come. Now he's waiting and waiting for this furlough. He got his bounty, and the Confederate Army promised a furlough. But as you may know, the war didn't go how they thought it would. It just got worse and harder and bloodier. So nobody got their furlough. He mentions his children. What I don't have time to tell you about is that he was briefly married to someone before Elizabeth. He was married to her cousin. She died in childbirth. So he had one child already that was being raised by those in-laws.
Did that child then come live with her?
No, and we're not sure why. But other than it would have been another mouth to feed, yeah. Okay, so you may know that North Carolina's, one of their license plate mottos, and I lived there for 13 years, is first in flight. So I had one of them. First in flight, the Wright brothers, right? Well, they were first in flight in desertion as well. So it was only a matter of time for Rufus to kick it home, which he did eventually. He takes an unofficial furlough in the spring of 1863. It is 1863. And then the letters stop, and then in November of 1863, they begin again, and his first letter back to her is from the guardhouse in Richmond, where he has been imprisoned for having deserted, to go home, help her, haul in the crops, be with his family, visit, help his mother-in-law, or his own mother. So he writes her from the guardhouse, and he says, oh gosh, this was a good line. I've lost my place. Oh, yes. He says, I wouldn't have been here if I hadn't thought so much of you all. So then from that time forward, they have a regular correspondence. January of 1864, we're kind of approaching the end of the end. He writes her and acknowledges some words he's been waiting for. He says, I can inform you that I received your loving letter last night, and I was glad to hear that you was all well and doing well. I was glad to hear that you had sold the mules. I want you to write when you sold it. And then he goes on, take good care of everything you have. I'm afraid there's a great many that will suffer before there's anything to be made, which means before you can get the crops in. I think there's going to be a great deal of suffering. About 4 months later, he sends the very last letter, not from a prison. He acknowledges the receipt of her last letter, and it appears to have been her last letter to him that he ever got. May 4th, 1864, he writes her, "I was truly glad to hear from you that you was all well, but sorry to hear that you lost your bacon." Someone had stolen the preserved, pork and bacon from their barn. And he goes on to give her good instructions for hiding the corn, because seriously, people were starving and stealing and fighting and killing over the food in their county. And he stops halfway through the letter to go fight the Union Army, and then he finishes the letter that night. And that fight is what's known as the Battle of Wilderness. It becomes the Battle of the Wilderness. And then he goes to what becomes known as the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in Virginia, and that's where he's captured by the Union Army. He first goes to Point Lookout on the coast of Maryland, and then he's transferred up to Elmira prison camp in August of 1864, which, as you may know, is called Helmira. It was the deadliest Union prison camp. 25% of the soldiers there died of disease. All right. So he writes his last letter to her on January 1st of 1865. He hasn't heard from her in 8 months, and then he dies within the year. What is the rest of Elizabeth's story? There's a mule. That's not their mule, of course, but there's a lovely mountain mule. What is the rest of Elizabeth's story? She lives to a ripe old age. She lives until 1914. Do we have any of her words after the war? No, I can't find any. But we know through government documents that she is a success as a single till her death, head of household farmer, until her son Sidney comes of age and takes over the farm. Just 5 years after her husband's death, just in 1870, according to the U.S. Census, she has a 100-acre farm. It's valued at $500. Her personal estate is valued at $400. She's the sole adult running this farm. And her grain stores include winter wheat, Indian corn, oats, Irish potatoes. She has orchard produce. She has wool, stores of wool, 30 pounds of butter, 5 gallons of molasses, 100 pounds of honey. She was the major producer of honey for her area. And finally, we see on the agricultural census that her livestock included 2 horses, 2 milk cows, 1 other cow, 6 sheep, 12 swine, and no mules. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Now, usually the speech part of women's brain is 3 times as a man's brain. Women can speak far more and have...
The language.
Yes. But now he wrote 70 letters, she wrote 90. How do you explain the disparity in the numbers?
I have several answers for that. That's a great question. And one is that communicating with him was apparently not her priority, is one of those answers. But right, but the time that she had, yeah. Thank you.
By the time she sat down at the end of the day, she was crying.
Oh my gosh, right. And then one of the kids is crying. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much.